So let's talk through every single faction in Warhammer 40k 10th edition and look at one strong army list for each of them. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking army lists for Warhammer 40k. And I thought with 10th edition out in the wild for a couple of weeks now, with some serious tournament reports coming in, I thought it would be fun to take a look at people's current competitive thinking with each one of the Warhammer 40k factions, and just take a look at one example of a list that's done kind of well in a recent tournament, and see what sort of picks are being taken. For the 40k factions out there, there's certainly ones that are doing far better than others. Certainly towards the top tables, there's been a lot of Aeldari showing up, which does crowd out certain other factions, and a few of the ones considered less strong definitely haven't had the same sort of representation. Finding some tournament success was a bit trickier for them. For the purposes of this video, I thought I'd try and find at least one example of each army doing kind of well for tournament success, either with lists recorded in Best Coast pairings or Tourney Keeper. That should just give us one idea of what one player is running with each faction, though obviously it's not going to be the be-all and say-all for everything that you can do with an army. I'm sure a lot of these are thought through very well. But the 40k meta's in its very early stages at the moment. I'm sure there's plenty of combos and ideas that haven't been thought through properly yet, plus a fair few lists might be skewed to what people actually have in their collections. In this, we're definitely going to be talking through a whole ton of armies, and I'm sure I'll miss all sorts of subtleties, how the army was played, and major stratagems that might be used with certain units, so feel free to let me know anything major that I miss out as we go along. I'm sure it'll inform people better down in the comments. In any case though, let's get into it. We'll talk through Imperium first, starting with a standard Space Marine one, and then talk about their successor Space Marine chapters later in the Imperium section, then talk through Chaos and finish up with Xenos. First up, we're starting with the boys in blue for the Space Marines, and this is a Gladius task force for the Ultramarines, run by William Thurman, who used it to take 5th at the Alpine Grand Tournament. Quite a big achievement, that one. That went 5-1 against a field of 90 players. Leading the list, we have Guilliman himself. He can bring the double Oath of Moment to give some crazy rerolls against multiple different enemy units per turn, or potentially free stratagems if not. His own combat stats and ability to get back up from the dead are both pretty powerful in their own right. I believe that from the look of this, he's probably also paired with that lieutenant with the combi weapon as well. He's Space Marine Lone Operative Infantry, and I believe that he does trigger Guilliman's Lone Operative keyword as well. So in theory, you could have both of these guys just stand out in the open, and you wouldn't be able to shoot at either of them from long range. That does seem pretty powerful in a game where there's lots of knights with massive shooting and a whole load of indirect fire. There's also a Primaris Apothecary as well, who looks like it's his job to join the Desolation Squad. He's mainly there to bring Bolter Discipline, so sustained hits on either 6s or 5s in Devastator Doctrine, really quite a boost to their firepower, and with Oath of Moment they're going to be a threat to most things on the table. Their barrage fire will clear infantry very nicely indeed, and then they can always set up to use their super cracks if that makes more sense for a turn, although that does mean exposing them to harm's way. Besides that, there's 5 infiltrators with a Helix and Comms array who can screen out some objectives, 5 Stern Guard veterans with bolt rifles, a few nice devastating wound shots there, and they seem like quite good line infantry. Plus they do have that rather powerful ability to fire twice once per game. Could be a really powerful flurry of anti-infantry damage if they can wipe a unit. Rounding up though and actually doing the majority of the damage of the list besides the Desolation Squad are 5 very big scary vehicles, 3 Redemptor Dreadnoughts with Macroplasma, Gatling Cannons, Stormbolters and the Icarus Pods. Very strong frontline units there, particularly with Oath of Moment to reroll the Macroplasma against tough stuff. They've all got -1 damage and a 2+ save baked in now. Then there's a Repulsor Executioner, kind of fun to see one of these being run competitively again. I guess that could have the option to transport the Stern Guard if it made sense. This one's got the big tank hunting heavy laser destroyer, and a bunch of small arms. Finally, there's a really potent Gladiator Lancer, with again a very similar laser destroyer type weaponry, but loads of rerolls just baked into this, maybe one that could be comfortably fired at things that aren't being hit by Oath of Moment. Overall seems pretty scary, a big beatdown gun line with a whole load of general purpose firepower, big rerolls from Guilliman, and some very scary desolation happening with the enemy's units getting hoovered up by the Desolation Squad. I feel like the Devastator Doctrine for Gladius will be quite good for this as well. Being able to advance and shoot with anything could be really quite good for getting lines of sight. Next up, we've got Imperial Guard Artillery, this one run by Rhys Cunningham, who used it to take first at the Geelong Town Open, 5-0 against a field of 50 players. Guard in 10th edition seem to have had massive buffs to both artillery and sentinels, and this list really leans hard into both of them. Leading the army, I feel like is going to be a common pairing of Lord Solar Leontus and Ursula Creed. Lord Solar is very near to auto-include for the Guard, I think. Absolutely amazing orders. It's strangely the best way to get tank orders these days. Really quite a nice redeployability, but also just farming command points all game long as well. Ursula Creed can allow free stratagems on units nearby, never mind doing a few orders herself as well. Again, hard to go too far wrong there. There's also a platoon command squad with the regimental attaches attached, so they can be a master of the ordnance for focusing down some artillery fire if you want. Could be potentially helpful for the guard artillery stratagem as well, as they have a Vox caster, potentially gaining some extra AP against one key target that you need to focus down. I guess the characters are likely to be attaching to some of those infantry bodyguards. There's 2 units of 10 Cadian shock troops with Melter Plasma and Vox. I guess at least one of them is for Ursula Creed, given the Cadian, I guess. And then there's 2 units of the really quite nice Deathcore new squad. They have Plasma Melter Gun and Grenade Launcher plus a power weapon. They feel like perhaps the superior infantry squad to me now, what with the reviving models and getting some serious damage buffs on special weapons and depleted units. There's then 2 units of Tempestus Scions, which will be quite good for dropping around and doing tactical objectives, or behind enemy lines I suppose. And then we really have the meat of the list, a whole bunch of Sentinels screening a whole bunch of artillery. For the artillery, we've got no less than 3 Basilisks and 3 Manticores, enormously efficient ignores line of sight firepower with 2 or 3 damage. The Manticores are very general purpose with full rerolls to hit against big squads, but then the damage characteristic to hit tough stuff as well. And the Basilisks are very general purpose with strength 8 and damage 2, and can slow down enemy units as well, pretty brutal on slower moving Terminators. Then Sentinels are incredibly tanky and at least fairly dangerous for the guard now. There's a unit of 3 armoured ones with las cannons, hunter killers and chainsaws, plus they could be a really interesting one for using that reinforcement stratagem on to come back to the board if your opponent's slogged through them once already. And then 3 units of scout sentinels who can scout out into the midfield, 3 with plasma which is quite nice against big ranked up hordes, and a unit of 2 and a unit of 3 with hunter killer missiles and las cannons. Quite a solid alpha strike of anti-tank there with all of those hunter killer missile shots, plus they can mark targets for the artillery to get them some reroll ones and ignoring the barrage penalty. Overall looks like a tough list to play against. A lot of artillery you might struggle to get to engage, lots of sentinels that are just enormously tough and can potentially be recycled, and then a whole bunch of command points and stratagems being thrown at you between Lord Solar and Ursula Creed. Looks pretty solid overall. I feel like it's maybe a little bit of a shame though that the artillery is quite so outclassing the tanks to the extent where people might not be taking any. Next up, we've got Adeptus Custodes. This was a list by someone called Scotty B, who used it to take second at a tournament called Hometown 40K. They went 4-1 with it against a field of 42 players. Again, a seriously impressive result. This list appears to be 3 really quite solid blocks of custodians led by different characters. There's a Blade Champion, Shield Captain and Trajan Valoris. And it looks like they're heading up 2 big units of Custodian Guard with a big 9 of them with spears and 1 shield and a Vexilla, and then 1 unit of 6 Wardens, again with Guardian Spears and a Vexilla in them. The standard Custodian profile is just very strong all round, nice and tanky with a 2+ save, 4+ invul and toughness 6 now, and Guardian Spears en masse can handle just about any target that goes into them, loads of strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2. Ideally they'd want to stay within range of objectives. That means that they can fight first if the enemy charges into them, meaning that they're just basically unchargeable for a bunch of stuff. The Custodian Guard gets some massive full wound rerolls if they're on an objective, and the Wardens trade that out for being extra tanky, a 4+ feel no pain once per game, and -1 to wound if there's a character nearby. For the character buffs, the Blade Champion gets them a very long strike range, potentially allowing them to advance and charge. It's a pretty good all-rounder character as well, with multiple different fight modes to take down different foes. The Shield Captain gives you some nice free stratagems, could use it for the one to resurrect a Custodian from the dead, there's plenty of other decent ones, and Trajan Valoris is just an absolutely massive melee combatant with some big advantages from the moment shackle. He also protects his squad against modifiers, which can be handy. Then to back them up, there's a unit of 3 Alaris Custodians with spears, then a unit of 2 with the same. They could be handy small units to deep strike around the board and do certain objectives, or engage foes that are a bit further away. Plus they've got some seriously nice damage boosts against certain targets like characters or big stuff. Then for a little bit more hidden grunt work, there's also 2 small 5-man exaction squads, kind of surprisingly cheap Adeptus Arbites, 5-man squads with a 4+ armor and a 5+ feel no pain, at least fairly survivable for the cost. Then finally there's a Vindicare Assassin, some nice sniper damage with a chance to pick off characters. Some armies will definitely find that intimidating to have in the list. A few factions really rely on their support characters. Not some massive melee might here. I do kind of wonder if this might have been for a tournament that didn't allow Forge World in it. The rules and points did drop a little bit later than the standard Custodes stuff, I guess. Wouldn't be too surprised if things were mixed up a bit with some Caladius Grav tanks for fighter support, at least for quite a lot of Custodes lists going forward. Next up, we've got the Adepta Sororitas, certainly a faction that I struggle to find lists doing quite as well as some of the other examples. Sisters do seem to be in a bit of a bad spot at the moment. Despite still having kind of powerful faction rules, a lot of their data sheets just don't do what they did before anywhere near as easily as they could, losing things like serious threat range on Repentia squads, for example, or the Bloody Rose melee buffs, and multi-melters are just a lot worse than they were, wounding a whole load of vehicles on 5s rather than 4s and 3s, and also getting much shorter range thrown in. For one example of a competitive sisters list, here we've got one by Kenneth Zuck, who used it to place 19th at Hometown 40K, going 3-2 against a field of 42 players. At least scouring the tournament results, I couldn't really see anyone doing particularly better than this. Leading the list, we've got a Canoness with a Blessed Blade, and it's tuned up to the next level of damage with the Blade of St. Eleanor for a damage 3 sword there, plus getting an Inferno pistol as well. There's also Celestine, who's a bit cheaper, but maybe not quite as threatening. She still resurrects on death, though, and I guess that she'd be joining one of the big Seraphim units. And the Triumph of St. Catherine is here, still looks like a very annoying model to destroy with the sheer amount of wounds it has, and does give out some fairly helpful buffs to nearby sisters of your choice at the start of each command phase, can help out with melee or get some 6 miracle dice or things like that. For the squads, there's a unit of 10 Battle Sisters, now locked to squad size 10. They've got a Heavy Bolter, Melter Gun, Hand Flamer, a Power Weapon, and a Simulacrum Imperialis. They can farm Miracle Dice if they sit on objectives, so I guess that's probably going to be their role. There's a unit of 10 Celestian Sacrosants with Halbards and 1 Inferno pistol. They're quite nice for a slightly more tanky unit, so it could be interesting to have the Canoness join maybe. There's 2 units of 5 Retributors with 4 Multi-Melters and an Inferno pistol in. I think that they look like they're riding into Immolators up the board, which have got Flamers. The Immolators can use that rule that allows them to reroll wounds after disembarking. That does seem like it pairs pretty well with them. Strength 9 Melter definitely needs all the help it can do to punch up against things like Toughness 12 Knights. There's then 2 really quite big units of 10 Seraphim. One's got 8 Inferno pistols, so a fairly fearsome anti-tank threat if you can get in close with those, and the other has 4 Infernos and 4 Hand Flamers, perhaps a little bit more general purpose. They do have the potential of being a bit tricky as well, as they get a move, shoot, move, though they do have quite close range weapons, which might limit shenanigans a little bit, I suppose. Maybe it could be fun to rapid ingress as well. I suppose that could be one way to get a whole bunch of Inferno pistols and Celestine up close. There's 3 Paragon Warsuits. They've got a Holy Trinity of Melter, Flamer, and Heavy Bolter. They've also got Maces and Blades in melee. Look like a bit more of a mixed unit, that one. And finally, there's the Vindicare for some big sniping action, and the Calidus for the big disruption to the enemy units. Increasing a stratagem by 1 command point and potentially jumping on and off the board could be kind of handy for tactical objectives. Overall, this definitely feel like an army that's struggling a bit in 10th edition. I do feel like the multi-melter changes, amongst other things, it hit them really quite hard, plus the loss of serious melee buffs in Bloody Rose. Next up, and also a faction broadly in a less than ideal spot in 40k currently, is the Adeptus Mechanicus. Though someone who's managed to place quite well with them was William McPherson, who used this to take 10th at the Boise Cup, winning 4 out of 5 games with a little bit more of an unusual AdMech build, largely centered around 2 fairly enormous units of Castellan robots with fists and then flamers. Kind of fun that, as I've seen quite a lot of people just running absolutely loads of Cataphren breaches with the arc rifles. It is kind of cool to see the Castellan robots have some success. I guess they are fairly general purpose with a bunch of strength 12 and damage 3 attacks, and they can be augmented to have quite a lot of attacks if you put them in the right protocol. One of them's got Excoriating Emanation for a -1 to hit with stealth. The other one has Master Annihilator, which as best I can tell doesn't really do anything. Not 100% sure about that one. Otherwise, there's a couple of Tech Priest Engine Seers, which I guess at least one of them will be looking after that Scorpius Disintegrator, giving it a 4+ invulnerable save as it blazes away with a Ferromite cannon. One of them gets Archived Purge Protocols, allowing you to swap between the Doctriners for 1 Skitarii unit, so you can mix things up a bit each turn. Cole himself can give out some stealth, or also allow you to reroll hit rolls of 1 for a bit more damage, plus his own combat profile isn't terrible, I guess. And then on the battle line, there's a bunch of Rangers and Vanguard. The Vanguard in particular should be decent enough against infantry with all those auto wounds. Finally, there's a few unit of 3 Einstrider Ballistari with the las cannons. Definitely a bit of a power come down compared with 9th edition, but they still do get some solid las cannon shots that get to reroll the wound roll as well, even if they're not quite as fearsome as they were. Overall, pretty nice to see AdMech doing well in a tournament. They're certainly an army that's hard to win with at the moment, and quite cool to do it with some Castellan robots as well. Next up, for the Grey Knights, they're another faction that maybe hasn't been having quite such a good time of it in 10th edition. Their special rule certainly has a lot of big power with the massive redeployment that their teleport rule can bring, but a lot of their units have a bit of trouble dealing with high armoured targets. They just don't have that much strong stuff. and being able to be all over the board only has so much value if you're still going to really struggle to kill stuff when you get there. One example of an interesting competitive list I saw was this one by Zampokar, who used it to take 22nd at the Alpine Grand Tournament, going 4 wins to 2 losses in that one. It's kind of interesting just how simple this list is. Basically it looks like 4 different characters leading 4 Brotherhood Terminator squads, each of those units being fairly tanky, packing an Incinerator for a bit of anti-infantry, getting an Arthesium for the Apothecary in there, and the Ancient's Banner for some more objective control. Interestingly, 3 of those characters are Librarians as well, seeming to go just all in on the Vortex of Doom Mortal Wounds there, usually throwing out 2d3 of them against the enemy target, unless you roll a Fatal 1 and you get d6 on your own unit instead, which does seem kind of high risk, high reward. They also get an interesting enough psychic sniping attack called Purge Soul as well, which could be kind of big against characters if you could get multiple of them off. And they're also carrying around 3 out of the 4 Grey Knights enhancements as well. First for the Fray for 1 units to Deep Strike turn 1, Citadel of Exigence for that very powerful ability to teleport away when shot, and the other one has Inescapable Wrath, +1 to charge rolls made for the Bearer's unit, kind of nice if you're almost certainly going to be making charges out of Deep Strike at some point. Then leading the last squad there's Caldor Drago, fairly threatening melee himself with strength 8 and damage 3 on his combat, and his big rule is to give you +3 to your charge once per game, so he's very likely to get his unit into combat straight out of Deep Strike. Could be quite a big move, that one. Finally, backing them up, there's a strike squad that looks like it could be used to just hold down home field objectives and things that are perhaps a bit safer, and then Castell and Crow leading a great big Purifier squad as well. Castell and Crow doubles the amount of Purifying Flame shots that they get that have anti-infantry 2+. I guess if you're looking for an absolutely dedicated anti-infantry killing squad, then that'd be good for those. Still looks like a list that would have to make absolute use of its good movement shenanigans to make sure it's getting the fights that it needs to, and avoiding stuff that can kill the Terminators quite too easily. Kind of interesting having an army that's basically 5 big blocks of dangerous things, and having those things being able to blink on and off the board if they like, but it would be quite a big deal if anything bad caught up with them. Next up, we've got the Imperial Knights, who are certainly having a very good time of it in 10th edition. They seem to have had a fair bit of success at multiple tournaments, just bringing massive amounts of firepower, lots of high toughness, high wound profiles. There's a lot of armies just can't really handle all that well. And of course, the rather nasty towering special rule, which often means that you can defeat line of sight blocking terrain, though it does sound like Games Workshop might be making some sort of amendments to that later this week. The Knights give you a 6+ feel no pain and big rerolls, lots of extra damage and defense, and they get more from their stratagems as well. Just a big powerhouse of a codex really, with enormous stats. This list was one that I talked about last week on the channel by Adam Holland, perhaps one of the biggest Knight victories so far, taking first at the Boise Cup, 5-0 against 50 players. In the list there's a Knight Crusader with the Gatling Cannon and Rapid Fire Battle Cannon, an enormous amount of mid-strength, mid-damage shots there. It's also got the Storm Spear rockets on top for a bunch of strength 8 damage d6 hits, and the Mythic Hero enhancement that allows you to throw his Bondsman ability onto 2 different armigers. He gives out +1 to hit at range, so it could be kind of nice with the 2 Helverins with the autocannons perhaps. Then there's a Knight Warden with the Gatling Cannon, Thunderstrike Gauntlet and Storm Spear rocket pods. The Warden gets devastating wounds on that enormous 18-shot damage 2 Gatling Cannon, provided it's targeting non-vehicles and non-monsters. Its Bondsman ability is also very good for Knights, getting a -1 damage both on itself and on one of the armigers. Perhaps one of the most important things for Knights, given that they often can't hide behind terrain or anything like that, and there's just too many big vehicles to avoid getting shot. This one takes Unyielding Paragon for ignoring a pip of AP on enemy shooting. Could be really big against anything that's AP -1 and AP 2, and might mean that you don't have to rotate. Finally, for the foot troops, there's 2 Helverins with the heavy stubbers. Nice Knights to hold down the backfield objectives and still very mobile, and then 5 Armiger Warglaves with melter guns and the Thermal Spears, the Thermal Spear being a pretty devastating anti-tank weapon with the Strength 12 and Melter 4 rule. Finally, there's a Vindicare Assassin that people credited me in the last video that perhaps one of his best uses is to try and slay the Warlords to make the Knight Army honoured and give them a 5+ feel no pain. Handy enough just to have an extra model with Lone Operative as well, though the opponent has struggled to catch up with them on certain objectives maybe. Overall, definitely a lot of raw strength here. In other variants of Knight lists, I've been seeing Canis Rex played really quite a lot as well. He's another fantastically powerful datasheet. Finally, for the Imperial armies, let's take a look at how the Divergent Space Marine chapters are getting on, and start out with the Sons of Sanguinius and the Blood Angels. This list was run by Jordan Checkley, who used it to take 3rd at the 40k Brawl GT, getting 4 wins and 1 loss. This list still feels very Blood Angels and makes use of a lot of their units, but it is using the Gladius Task Force as opposed to their unique launch detachments. The extra damage on the charge is kind of nice, but I feel like quite a lot of people that are sort of speculating that the Blood Angels might be more tempted by the Gladius, particularly with things like Advance and Charge on offer, which is kind of big for getting their scary assault units to combat. There's been a bit of a reversal on 10th edition as well, with no Sanguinary Guard whatsoever in this army. They certainly are on the very pricey side at 43 points per model, I think. Being Space Marines, the Blood Angels here haven't been able to turn down the allure of 10 Desolation Marines alongside a Primaris Apothecary with Bolter Discipline. They certainly seem to do enough work no matter what flavour of Space Marine you are. But besides them, the mainstay of the list is built around 2 big units of Assault Marines and 1 big unit of Death Company with jump packs. Looks like each of the Assault Marine units are headed up by a Sanguinary Priest with a jump pack. They give a 5+ feel no pain to their unit, plus also improve the AP of their weapons by 1 as well, both of which are just absolutely fantastic on the Assault Marines, and they are fairly scary melee threats in their own right, with a bunch of damage 2 attacks from Eviscerators and perhaps a Thunderhammer, plus their impact hits with mortal wounds, which could do quite a bit to hard targets. Dante also joins one of those units, giving them +1 to hit and +1 to charge, plus his own combat stat line. And then Lamartes heads up a Death Company unit with a bunch of Inferno Pistols and Power Fists. Seriously scary stuff if they get close to you, particularly with all of those melter shots. I kind of wonder if they could be an interesting enough unit to rapid ingress maybe, though I guess could certainly have a very long charge threat range on the board as well. Otherwise, there's a small unit of 3 Eradicators with melter rifles for some big rerolls against vehicles, a unit of 5 Incursors, which I'm guessing are handing out a +1 to hit for the Desolation Squad if they can. Could be pretty solid with those Inferno Pistols from the Death Company as well, and they are just a few more bodies to get into the midfield on objectives. And finally, there's a Baal Predator here as well, a Flamestorm Cannon and Heavy Flamers. Kind of feel like with full flame mode that could be quite an interesting Overwatch choice. Park it next to a midfield objective and dare the enemy to come and take it with some infantry. Looks fun and feels very Blood Angels despite being Gladius. The assault squads with the priests in particular look particularly fun to use. Next up we've got the Black Templars, again an army that I couldn't really find all that much top table representation for tournaments at yet. I feel like their detachment rules aren't terrible though. Maybe we'll see a bit more of them in the future with the 6+ feel no pains they can get for the Space Marine faction. This list was one I noticed on Best Coast Pairings that won a very small tournament at a Cafe Bratspil, run by an Alexander Lerbrand, going 3-0 against 8 players. This one again is a Gladius Task Force list. Leading it up we've got Helbrecht and the Emperor's Champion, who I guess are joining the Sword Brethren squads probably. It looks like they could ride in the Land Raider Redeemer perhaps, and get some very very long charges right into the heart of the enemy. Quite nice the way that could slingshot them forward here. The Land Raider Redeemer will be quite nice for Overwatch as well potentially. Then there's also a couple of Primaris Lieutenants. I'd guess that one might go alongside Helbrecht perhaps. The more frontline one has Artificer Armor for a bit of extra toughness, and the other one has Bolter Discipline, and they look like they would join the big Hellblaster squad, a 10-man unit that's really going to like the lethal hits that the Lieutenant can bring, plus 4 back and shoot. It looks like a really good one to do things with Oath of Moment as well. Then there's 2 units of 5 Infiltrators, quite good to sit on objectives and defend them against deep strikers, and 2 Terminator Assault Squads with hammers and shields, really quite nice tanky units that are pretty general purpose with the devastating wounds against tough stuff. One of them has a Chaplain and Terminator armor in it, very nasty for the +1 to wound there. Again, could be an interesting unit to rapid ingress maybe. I think it's quite nice to see some Black Templars in action, really quite like the way that you can have a Land Raider Redeemer full of Sword Brethren, and it actually being a credible prospect in 10th edition as opposed to just something that would be very very underpowered bit in the previous one. Moving on, we've got the Sons of the Lion in the Dark Angels. This list actually does make use of their unique detachment, and it was run by Darren Oakter, who used it at a team tournament called Gladiator Games. And while team tournaments might have a bit of a different dynamic compared with standard tournaments in 10th, this definitely seems to have proved itself against a bunch of opponents, winning 4, drawing 2, but not losing any. The list does look like quite an interesting Dark Angels one. Some solid representation from Deathwing and Ravenwing, plus perhaps a surprising amount of scouts as well. For the Deathwing side of things, there's 2 absolutely enormous Deathwing units, 1 command squad with 5 hammers and shields, 2 cyclone missile launchers, and then the specialists with the Apothecary, the Banner, and the Champion. I'd guess perhaps that might be the Chaplain going with them maybe for the +1 to wounds. He also gives them +1 to hit as well if the unit's below starting strength with Stubborn Tenacity, his enhancement. Then looks like there's a pairing of a captain and an ancient in Terminator armor, I'd guess probably for the Deathwing Knights, though I don't know. The captain in Terminator armor can give you some free stratagems, he's got a hammer and shield, and he can give them reroll charges as well, kind of handy for closing in. He takes the Heavenfall Blaze to make his Thunderhammer more dangerous than usual. +1 to attack, strength and damage does make that a very general all-purpose weapon. Having the Ancient as well also gives you another Thunderhammer and Storm Shield unit. He adds to the objective control and again gives you buffs when the unit gets depleted, so half killing these Terminators will make their damage output go up for the rest of them for both units. And he also has a Penance of Remembrance for a 6+ Feel No Pain too. Overall just two very enormous and scary units, and as with a bunch of big scary deep strike things in 10th, could be a target for rapid ingress potentially. Besides the Terminators, the 3 units of 3 bikes, running around and getting tactical objectives perhaps, and then perhaps a surprising amount of scouts that could help hold up the midfield, 3 units of 5 scouts with kind of mixed war gear, perhaps more important as bodies and holding points as much as anything else. They really are quite cheap and they can forward deploy. And then 1 unit of the sniper scouts, which I do think are rather good at the moment, getting essentially lone operative, can't shoot them, would be very nice for a backfield objective. Finally, there's 2 Ravenwing Dark Shrouds to give you some serious durability when you're near them. I'd guess they'd want to coordinate with the Terminators as they move up towards midfield objectives, perhaps. Kind of interesting to see a 10th edition version of basically supported Deathwing. Definitely a lot of raw might in those 2 big units. I do kind of wonder if we'll see many Dark Angels lists featuring the Lion in the future. He does look phenomenally hard to take out and very dangerous, though maybe doesn't offer as much synergy as Guilliman perhaps. Next, for the Xenos Hunting Space Marines, we've got the Deathwatch. This one's a list by Terence Drew, who used it to take 6th at Geelong Town Open, going with 4 wins and 1 losses. Deathwatch definitely is a faction that has been having a bit more top table success than perhaps the other Divergent chapters, I'd say. Their core strength being a bit more ranged does seem to gel quite well with Oath of Moment and Indirect Fire and 10th edition in general, perhaps. The list is mainly some scary teleporting supported Deathwatch squads, accompanied by a couple of Whirlwinds putting out some Ignores line of sight fire support at the back, and there's really quite a lot of Terminators too. First up looks like there's a captain in Terminator armor who I guess will be joining a squad of 5 Deathwatch Terminators. They've got 3 Cyclone missile launchers, so a fair bit of range threat there, plus a Chain Fist on the missile Terminators and 2 Thunderhammers and Storm Shields for the remaining ones. Very nice for free stratagems and could use some of the specialist Deathwatch shooting buffs. They've taken the Beacon Angelis, so they get to use the rapid ingress stratagem for 0 CP. Definitely one way to get yourself into the heart of the enemy lines. Then there's 2 Apothecary Biologists. These ones look like they're heading up 2 units of 6 Eradicators. These ones could also perhaps be interesting for doing teleport tricks with. I suppose you could strategic reserve them, or you could put them behind your lines and use the Teleportarium stratagem to get them in range of their targets. A massive 6 Eradicators with some auto wounds from the Apothecaries looks like it's really quite powerful. Should give you some punch enough to bring down some of the biggest things like enemy knights or wraith knights perhaps. One of the Apothecaries gets the Thief of Secrets. Looks like that could just be used to fill a few points as it's a small melee boost. There is a great big unit of 10 Desolation Marines. You can't seem to get too far away from them with Space Marines, it would seem. Deathwatch can be extra nasty with them, just with the raw buffs that you get from their detachment. Things like lethal hits, precision, or sustained hits are all kind of brutal on top of their already good profile. And they could also use the Wounds Infantry on a 2+ thing with those Castellan launchers. That would make them kind of horrific even against tough infantry. Finally, looking like they're manning the battle line for the Deathwatch, there's 2 big Proteus kill teams, each of them with 6 veterans with 2 Deathwatch Thunderhammers, a bit more threatening than the regular variety. 4 of them take the Infernus Heavy Bolters with a choice of either Heavy Bolters or Heavy Flamers, big Overwatch threat there. And then there's 4 Terminators with 3 Cyclone missile launchers in them, plus 1 tanking one with a Thunderhammer and Storm Shield. Quite a fun loadout for the kill teams there, really going all in on the damage dealing. Having 2 of them as well could make them pretty efficient for some of the special issue ammunition stratagems if you'd like to use them. Quite a fun looking Deathwatch list, this one. I still feel like in 10th edition they are an army that you can really customise in all sorts of different ways, though perhaps a few things do seem to be a bit obvious, like say the Proteus kill team really wants to be taking Terminators now. Lots of scary firepower here, loads of direct stuff with the Eradicators and the Proteus, and then lots of indirect with the Whirlwinds and Desolation Marines. Does overall seem like it to be pretty tricky to handle. Finally, for the Imperium, we've got the Space Wolves, generally considered to be one of the weaker out of the Divergent chapters, at least by their launch detachment, and maybe not too surprised to see the Wolves of Ross falling back on the Gladius here, or at least in this one list example by Donny Otto, who used this list to take 6th at the Rage GT, a tournament of 27 players, going 3 wins, 1 draw and 1 loss. This one does look like a quite nicely balanced Space Marine list, a fair bit of standard infantry, some tanks and vehicles, plus some characters to lead up things. Perhaps the biggest thing for the Space Wolf flavour are 2 great big units of Thunderwolf cavalry. Definitely a bit less threatening now a lot of their attacks became damage 1, but they still are fairly cheap for the cost at just 33 points per model now basically, and are at least fairly tanky with their storm shields. Looks like one of those is headed up by Logan Grimnar on Storm Rider. He's got some personal melee threat and gets command points for killing units as well. And looks like the other one's joined by Wolf Lord on Thunderwolf, Thunderhammer Plasma Pistol and the Artificer armor upgrade, so he's quite hard to kill when the enemy can attack him directly. I feel like the Thunderwolf cavalry will really quite like the advance and charge in the Gladius. Means they should have a pretty massive threat range, perhaps particularly with the Wolf Lord giving them +1 to advance and charge as well. And when they do charge into the enemy, their damage output goes up. They get damage 2 on those weapons, which is quite nice against medium infantry, so are at least a little bit general purpose if they are charging rather than being charged. Otherwise, there's 3 different flavours of Intercessor, some Assault Intercessors to try and do some damage on the midfield I suppose, Heavy Intercessors which genuinely are very tanky and probably ideally what you want your opponent to be shooting at if they can, and a regular Intercessor squad which could give you some sticky objectives, plus deal with some enemy light infantry. There's 3 Eradicators to help with tanks a little bit, a couple of Whirlwinds to put the hurt down on enemies out of line of sight. Looks like they're being buffed by a land speeder with a multi-melter as well, who can give them basically +1 to hit and ignores cover. And that buff could also help out the nearby Vindicator as well, a really fearsome blast weapon with strength 14 and damage d6. Finally, there's a Redemptor Dreadnought with Gatling cannons and Fragstorm grenades as well, so at least a few more big scary threats moving forward into the midfield alongside those Thunderwolves. Finally, the only other thing that I hadn't mentioned was Ragnar Blackmane as well. I guess he'd probably lead the Assault Intercessors into battle. He can give that unit advance and charge all the time, not just in the Assault Doctrine. That's pretty brutal in melee when he gets there, with a massive 10 attacks at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 2, which is rather impressive by 10th edition combat standards. Overall looks like a fun list. Nice to see with some success with some actual standard battle line Space Marine foot troops, which feel like they're a little bit sidelined right now. I feel like Space Wolves armies might well be building around Thunderwolves if you are taking them as a faction. They do seem to be fairly solid value for their damage and defense still. Next up, we're into the realm of Chaos, and we're starting out with the Chaos Space Marines. Generally, I'd say one of the more mid-tier factions in 40k right now. I feel like perhaps their stratagems are one of the most powerful things that they have access to, doing some seriously crazy things like shielding units from being able to be shot by the Mark of Nurgle one, or massive unrestricted full rerolls with the Undivided one, particularly nice on Forge Fiends to fish for some devastating wounds. This is a list by someone called Erez Luthi, who used it to take 11th at the Alpine Grand Tournament, with 4 games, 1 draw and 1 loss. I've seen quite a lot of lists running Abaddon and 10 Terminators, using all the Chaos marks that he gets and giving them lots of different options. It looks like in this one Abaddon might well be joining the Legionaries, I'd guess. Perhaps more of a personal guide just to get Abaddon himself into battle. He does get his 4+ invulnerable save that he can give to nearby infantry, so it's quite a good centerpiece anyway. I suppose he could also have the Forge Fiends full re-rolling to hit as well, which looks kind of nasty. Then there's also Fabius Bile as well. He's been improved considerably from 9th edition, enhancing one squad. I'd guess the very big Chosen squad in this one, giving them all +1 strength and +1 toughness, a lot more all-round might there. They appear to have a ride for a Rhino to get them into battle with Nurgle. With the Nurgle stratagem you could make that untargetable in the enemy's shooting phase, which is kind of powerful. And the Chosen themselves are Undivided, which could be good for the big full reroll stratagem. Then there's 2 fairly scary units of Possessed, a big unit of 10 of them with Undivided. Their attacks all have devastating wounds, so really quite general purpose, yet again one that's great with the full rerolls. And there's a smaller squad of 5 of them with Slanesh. They get some nice sustained hits in combat with their Dark Packs, plus also have the option to advance and charge as well. There's some cultists with firearms with the Mark of Nurgle, and then a few big guns with 3 Forge Fiends, all with triple Ectoplasma, all Undivided, and these guys are very good general purpose threats, able to give themselves devastating wounds, as well as packing a lot of blast weapons, so it means they can be pretty effective against either hordes or also against the toughest stuff in the game. Finally, there's a few interesting demon allies as well, 2 small units of 3 flamers, I guess pretty nice expendable deep strikers to jump down and do behind enemy lines or tactical objectives or something. Definitely good damage output against enemy infantry as well. And there's also Tzeentch's Changeling, which could be kind of disruptive as a deep striking lone operative. He can also put out a fairly serious amount of damage with his Infernal Flames, as well as messing with enemy shooting and being sort of hard to kill as well himself with an invul save and stealth. Looks like a fun Chaos list in any case. The Forge Fiends definitely have some pretty terrifying damage output. Next we've got Thousand Suns, and here's one list by Fabian Huber, finishing quite close to the previous one and taking 10th at the Alpine Grand Tournament. Again going 4 wins, 1 draw and 1 loss. Thousand Suns themselves not having too bad a time of it in 10th so far, with some really big damage combos, particularly with combinations of psychic shooting attacks and stripping all saves from enemy units. Leading up the army we do have Magnus the Red the Primarch, just really quite an all around efficient datasheet at the moment. Great buffs to damage output nearby with a +1 to wound and +1 to hit for psychic attacks, and also a serious amount of both psychic and melee damage as well that he also gets that same buff for. He's backed up by a trio of sorcerers who look like they're leading the Rubik Marine squads. They're just all around strong leaders at the moment, give you more points towards the Kabbalistic rituals, lethal hits for the unit which is always nice, stopping them being shot from greater than 18 inches away, again a very powerful defensive buff that, and also chipping in with some solid anti-infantry psychic shooting which might be buffed if Magnus is nearby. They also seem to be the focal point of some of the rituals as well, with one having Lord of Forbidden Law, meaning that you can double up on one psychic ritual if you'd like. That's particularly powerful with just how potent they are. They're almost all really good. Throwing out something like Double Doom Bolt, or even paying a whole load of points to strip the save from 2 units seems kind of massive. The Athenaean Strolls just gives you an extra ritual point, and then there's also a Terminator Sorcerer here as well who takes the Umbralific Crystal, very similar to how it worked before, just teleporting a squad across the board and getting them a good line of sight on something, kind of handy for slow moving termies. Then for the squads they're leading, the Sorcerers are in 2 big units of 10 Rupert Marines with Bolters and the Icon. Nice for holding down points, particularly when you can't shoot them unless you're close. There's one smaller unit that could be a bit more aggressive with Warp Flamers, could be nice for Overwatch. Then there's a big brick of Scarab Occult Terminators with 2 Hellfire Missile Racks. It'll give you the potential of doing the big damage combo with Psychic Shooting and then buffing that every which way, and then also removing the save on the target, pretty much guaranteeing that you almost certainly kill any one single unit in the game. I guess for running around and doing tactical objective type things, there's 3 units of 3 Zangor Enlightened, very cheap and slightly fast moving with the Divining Spears. You also get a reactive move as well, so a little bit harder to catch up with compared with some units. Finally, there's a Mutalith Vortex Beast, which is just all around an incredibly strong datasheet now. Lots of mortal wounds, quality shooting, okay melee, and pretty tough as well. Hard to go too far wrong with between 1 and 3 of those in Thousand Suns. Overall looks like a very solid and scary list with lots of psychic attacks, and it looks like you'd have the chance to throw around a lot of those Kabbalistic rituals over the course of the turn. Next we've got a Death Guard list, a faction that is really struggling at the moment, with the vast majority of Death Guard armies out there performing kind of dismally at tournaments, though at least one player seems to have bucked the trend and has rather impressively managed to go 5-0 at a grand tournament. Aidan Smalley took second at the Element Games Grand Slam with this list. Probably the most standout Death Guard things about it are that it's very heavy on the Plague Burst crawlers. There's 3 of those for some potential indirect fire, and there's also a Lord of Virulence to coordinate their firepower a bit better against targets that he can see. Mortarian's also here as well. Still a very tough individual model, and maybe a little bit more easy to hide at least in 10th edition rules. He can be obscured behind ruins and things now, though the fly change will have punished him a fair bit in terms of how he can actually interact with terrain. It looks like the Lord of Virulence and the Sorcerer and Terminator armor each go with a squad of Death Shroud Terminators. Could be interesting for rapid ingress potentially. I did think that the Death Guard Terminator Sorcerer datasheet did look like a fairly solid one when I looked at their index. He's got the potential to give his unit -1 damage in combat against one enemy, a fairly solid psychic shooting attack in Curse of the Leper, and also has his own combat stat line and a Pestilent Familiar to make it a bit more dangerous once per game. We've also got Typhus here as well, who looks to be heading up a squad of 20 Poxwalkers. Quite a fun little unit, that one. A big fighty melee character with horde support, -1 to hit for his zombies, and he can even restore them a little bit with his Eater Plague psychic attacks. Then to hold the battle line, there's 2 units of 5 Plague Marines, Melter Gun, Plasma Gun, Blight Launcher, and heavy plague weapons. 2 small units of cultists with firearms. A Rhino, I suppose, to get some Plague Marines where they need to be. And it's interesting to see that the Plague Burst Crawlers are cracking out some Plague Spitters again in 10th edition. They'd been almost exclusively run with Entropy Cannons during 9th. They are seriously potent against infantry, and again they could be very scary for Overwatch if they happen to be somewhat near an objective. Looks like a very cool list. I feel like even with an absolutely optimised Death Guard list though, it still could be a big challenge going into some of the absolutely terrifying stuff in 10th edition. So to go 5-0 with the faction in any capacity in 10th edition is a real achievement. Next up we've got Khorne's favourite Legion of the World Eaters, this list by Wojtek Sisteki, going 4-1 at a small grand tournament of 22 players. Angron leads this up, and it makes heavy use of Wardog Huntsman allies as well. Angron's still very much a general purpose melee threat in 10th edition, should be able to handle whatever he's thrown at, and he also gets the very powerful ability to threaten to respawn himself back onto the board as well, if you can roll a 666 on the World Eaters dice. You can give yourself a better chance of that with the Khorne Berserkers. There's also the Warlord trait Favourite of Khorne on the board here as well. That one also allows you to basically re-roll all the dice. I think rules as written, it's kind of a little bit broken as well at the moment. I think technically you're just allowed to keep on re-rolling the dice until you get the exact results that you want, basically. So even just with the obviously attended rules, it's still very powerful. Backing up Angron is a Demon Prince with the Helm of Brazen Ire. Kind of fun to see the actual on-foot Demon Princes being played a fair bit now that they have some powerful special rules, and perhaps the wings aren't quite as crucial as they were due to not interacting with terrain so well. He's very tanky with toughness 10, a 2+ save, and a 4+ invulnerable, and the Helm of Brazen Ire halves damage results against him as well. So against the right sort of firepower, he's very hard to bring down. He also gives World Eater's infantry within 6 inches a 4+ invulnerable save as well, so it could be handy enough if he could wind up next to some Khorne Berserkers at some stage, I guess. Talking of which, there's 2 units of Berserkers, both of which look like they hitch a ride in a Rhino alongside a Master of Executions. The Master of Executions gives them fight first, so you don't really want to think about charging them. They are at least fairly decent combat characters in their own right as well, having some bonuses against characters. One of them also takes the Berserker Glaive for extra fightiness, one that favoured of Khorne Warlord traits to allow them some rerolls on the blood dice. There's a unit of 10 Jackals, I'd guess probably for home field objectives, and then perhaps to help out a little bit with some tank busting duties, there's some allied War Dogs. They're really quite good for that role just on their raw stats, with 2 shots with that big scary Demon Breath Spear with Melter 4 within half range, but the Huntsman datasheet also doubles down on that, re-rolling wound rolls of 1 and damage rolls of 1 against vehicles and monsters, so pretty handy for helping you out against those sort of threats. Looks like a fun list, all very destructive and some really quite powerful melee threats. Kind of interesting to see a complete absence of 8-bound in this. I guess they are really quite expensive despite scouting. Next up, we've got the Chaos Demons. This list by Alkeos Ferotsis, who used it to take 5th at Monsterland GT, going 4-1 against a field of 34 players. This one's got 2 really big demons in Be'lakor and Shalaxi Hellbane, plus backed up by a whole load of Khornate melee with Blood Crushers and Flesh Hounds. Be'lakor's still an all-round very nasty threat. He's got a rule that counters gun lines very nicely, stopping you shooting any of their units unless you're 12 inches from them, at least for the ones that are close to him. He also protects some of that Shadow of Chaos himself, which means that you could have very close deep strike charges going on with any of the lesser demons in reserve potentially. There's then a Khornate Demon Prince on foot who has Argath King of Blades, so massive combat potential there, and also projects an aura of stealth as well. A Ren Master on a Blood Throne who can help amp up the other Khorne units and make them extra strength, AP and damage against one target. That's quite nice for a bunch of the units here, including the Demon Prince himself, plus the Blood Crushers. Shalaxi Hellbane is a very expensive datasheet at 400 points, so costs more than Be'lakor, but is also an absolutely terrifying threat on the board as well. Pretty tough to kill with toughness 10, 20 wounds and a 5+ feel no pain type save. For some reason the Slanesh demons are kind of hard to put down. Massive general purpose attacks at strength 14 and damage d6 +2, and then perhaps most importantly for any big threats that they happen to be tangling with. Every time you're fighting against monster, vehicle or character units, you get to reroll hits, wounds and damage, so the damage output's going to be absolutely apocalyptic against any of those targets. The Changelings here as well for some lone operative fun things, and then for the rest of the list we've got 3 units of Blood Crushers, which are just generally quite good general purpose combatants right now. Their impact hits ability is kind of nice as well, with a chance for a fair few mortal wounds when they make contact. Flesh Hounds are some nice fast moving outriders. Pink Horrors can be really quite tanky with their split rules. Nurglings still get some forward deploy, even if they don't hold objectives anymore, that can still be disruptive. There's a small unit of Flamers as well. Looks like a fun list, quite a few things going on here, particularly the absolutely terrifying threats of Be'lakor and Shalaxi, backed up by a bunch of other things that might be hitting you straight out of Deep Strike, or moving up the board under Be'lakor's protection. Lastly, for Chaos, we've got some Chaos Knights. They seem to have come off a little bit worse compared with their Imperial cousins, given that the Imperials just for some reason get enormous damage and defensive buffs. The Chaos Knights instead get things all about battle shock, but still get the very scary Knight profile guns, and mass high toughness armours, a challenge for quite a lot of armies to deal with. This list was run by Ryan McLeod, who used it to take 7th at Hometown GT, a 40-odd person tournament, and won 4 games out of 5. The list has 3 big knights and 4 little knights. For the big knights, we've got a Desecrator with the Chainsword and Aura of Terror enhancement. The main gun on that's still a pretty fantastic anti-tank weapon, particularly if you do happen to luck out and roll a big 6 with the Desecrator Laser Destructor, as it gets devastating wounds against monsters and vehicles. It's got pretty strong combat as well as a big aura of 9 inches for rerolls for War Dogs to reroll hit rolls of 1. Not too bad with all those brigands around, with all the 2+ to hit shooting. The aura also gives him the ability to get basically sticky objectives that spreads the terror range. Certainly doesn't hurt in a slightly lower model count army. Then there's a Despoiler with Battle Cannon, Gatling Cannon and Havoc Missile Pod, Just some massive raw firepower there with the towering keyword. That one also happens to get the Traitor's Mark for the Doom and Darkness ability to be active from Battle Round 1, so if you can get some battle shot going on enemy units early, this thing can go absolutely mad on the damage. Then there's a Knight Tyrant and the Castellan Passon, a Volcano Lance for some massive anti-tank, a Plasma Destructor that's very efficient against heavy infantry, going for more of the Desecrator Cannons that are more anti-infantry, and one Geist Strike anti-tank missile. He also picks up the Panoply of the Cursed Knights, which is -1 AP, very nice in combination with the 2+ save of the Tyrant, so you're saving las cannons on a 4+ without needing to rotate, or saving AP2 attacks with a 3+ save, potentially even more as well if you've got some cover. Finally, there's a set of 4 individual Wardog Brigands, which are perhaps one of the most efficient Wardog profiles. Big anti-tank with those thermal spears, even if it is a little bit more close range than before. Lots of shots with those chain cannons. They've gone to hitting on a 2+ now, which is very nice, and they also get extra AP against attacking the closest target as well, which is really nice for the chain cannon in particular, going back up to AP2. I think they're going to be a very popular datasheet in Chaos Knight lists. Overall, tons of raw power here. It's a very shooty Chaos Knight list, with basically all the knights but the Desecrator specs for shooting. A very solid amount of anti-tank as well, should be good for engaging its peers of the Imperial nature. Xenos next, and we'll start out with the terrifying Aeldari, a faction that Games Workshop at this point has already said is destined for nerfs sometime this week. I think at time of recording, out of around about the 14 or 15 big tournaments that have happened so far, Aeldari have won somewhere around 10 of them. Just a soft sign that at least a couple of their mechanics might be a bit busted. The main really problematic one is probably the interaction between automatic 6 face dice and their weapons that have devastating wounds. Either the heavy Wraith cannons for the Wraith Knight or the support weapon D cannons feed an automatic 6 into them, and you've got a very hefty amount of mortal wounds on your target that often don't really care about traditional line of sight blocking things due to either ignoring it or having the towering keyword. Farseers can line up that damage as well, so you get to swap low fate dice for automatic 6s, and can also give the Wraith Knight a -1 to wound as well, even though it's very tough for the cost already with a high toughness value and -1 damage. Otherwise in the list we've got a whole bunch of fire prisms, 3 of them that can all focus the fire through one of them, and they've got just some fantastically efficient Eldar anti-tank. Huge shots that basically gets to reroll all the hit and wound rolls due to their detachment rule plus their own crystal targeting matrix. They're just massively cost effective for the 125 points that they cost. Then there's some warp spiders to get your hands on enemy infantry. They can move 24 inches in a turn so can get line of sight, and maybe are a little bit susceptible to being hit back hard. 10 Dire Avengers with Azamon, who can put out some solid overwatch if they need to. A disruptive Autarch Wayleaper, who can jump around giving you some command points and also help out with tactical objectives perhaps. And some other ways of farming fate dice with a Death Jester with the Weeping Stones, and some Guardian Defenders who can also hang out protecting the Farseer. This list was one that I talked about the last week on the channel, run by Victor Smits, who used it to take first at a tournaments that I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce, and it definitely showcases some of the very strongest things that Eldar can put on the table at the moment. At least at time of recording they do seem to be operating a level above plenty of other armies out there. It does seem that at least a few units in their index could probably use a tweak on their rules or points. Next we've got a Drukhari list from their spiky cousins. This one was also one that I talked about on the channel the other week by George McCulloch, who used it to take second at Hellstorm All-Stars Heat 3, a 40-player tournament, and went 4-1 there. Drukhari have shifted a lot more to being a bit more of a shooty faction than a melee faction compared with last edition. This version of them does bring plenty of Dark Lancers, but also goes quite heavy on the Pain engines as well, with no less than 3 Kronos engines and 3 units of 2 Talos, all of which really are quite durable, particularly the Kronos for the points, and the Talos are quite nice general purpose threats with twin Haywire guns, twin Liquefy guns, and a Talos Gauntlet for close combat. He actually informed me on the last video that the Raxton Venoms are often put in Deep Strike to do work on actions and objectives, particularly the ability to do an action type thing and then hop back in the Venom apparently was very useful. And if they need to, they can be surprisingly shooty now with their free gun upgrades between a Liquefier, Oxifactor and Hex Rifle. There's also an Archon leading up a bunch of Cavalite warriors with a bunch of shooting weapons, and they look like they're chilling out in a Raider. The Archon makes the squad incredibly nasty in damage output when they're empowered, 4 rolls to hit and wound. For some Dark Lance fire support, there's 2 Ravagers, each with 3 Dark Lances, really quite big anti-tank and very cheap and effective for 95 points now. 2 squads of fast movers in a unit of 6 Reavers with Agonizer, Caltrops and Heat Lancers, and 2 units of 5 Scourges, each with 4 Dark Lances. They get to move, shoot, move, so have a good chance of staying safe while they're firing out all their damage. Finally, there's a Homunculus to lead one of the units of Rax, I guess, make them just a little bit more survivable and also help out with a bonus pain token from the start. Looks pretty fun, Really quite cool to see a look at the new Drukhari for 10th edition with a bit more of a slant towards shooting. Though I do feel like in the index a few of their combat units could probably do with coming down in points a little bit. Next up we've got Necrons, also a faction that's doing kind of well, and a few of their units can be pretty oppressive to deal with armies without some serious focused damage output. Trying to wipe out a buffed up squad of 20 Necron warriors like this might just be a completely pointless task for many armies, as you've got a bit of a disturbing chance of your squad's damage output just bouncing. This list looks like a really cool example of what Necrons can do right now, run by Richard Bracey, using it to take 4th at Geelong Town Open, a 50-player tournament, and winning 4 games out of 5. This one looks like a really good example of putting all the Necron reanimation synergies together. Resurrection Orbs, Reanimators, Ghost Arcs, and Cryptex all in the list. Looks like perhaps the 2 most important units in the list are a big block of Necron Warriors with 20 of them, and then a unit of 10 Lich Guard as well with swords and shields. Each of those appears to have an Overlord in them, armed with a Void Scythe and Resurrection Orb. That's the thing that allows them to reanimate both in one command phase and the opponent's one as well. One of them also has the Hypermaterial Ablator as well, also a really nice relic for both stealth and light cover at long range. I guess that in the 2 units there's going to be one Chronomancer and one Technomancer as well. The Chronomancer provides a -1 to hit, the Technomancer allows you a bit of healing, plus gives the squad a 5+ feel no pain. So both add to the durability of the squads that are going to be reanimating so much. If you shoot the squads, they've got the potential to use a free stratagem to get some models back immediately. The Overlord should make that free for one of the units each turn, and you could also pay for a command point for the other one, I guess. Plus there's the same rule on the go for Ghost Arc, which I guess will want to coordinate with at least one of the squads. That's also full of more Necron warriors. Finally, for reanimation things, there's a Canoptic Reanimator as well, which has really quite a big aura of allowing you to reanimate an extra D3 wounds every time you roll. And depending on when they're attacked and whether or not you use stratagems and the Ghost Arc and things, you could be reanimating something like 4 different times each battle round. The warriors also getting D3+3 models back each time they're on objectives, never mind the Canoptic Reanimator's extra ones. Also, to add to the nightmare of these units to take down, there's 2 units of 2 Cryptothralls as well. They can also attach to the unit via the Cryptex, and they're a lot tougher to take down than most of them, getting a 4+ feel no pain and 2 wounds. You could have them being the first models to kill and then reanimate them as your first port of call. And you might even struggle to snipe any characters out of the unit given that they can come back with a stratagem. The damage output of the squads I'd say is okay. I guess you can make it better with things like the Necron Warriors getting 4 wound rerolls for a stratagem. Though in general, if they just march up to the middle objectives and don't die, they're probably going to be doing their job. Otherwise, beyond the stuff that's already mentioned, there's a unit of 5 Immortals with Gas Blasters. I guess the Royal Warden might be attaching to them with the Sovereign Coronal. That's the one that gives other nearby units the effect of being led by a unit, so you could have those Canoptek Doomstalkers hitting on a +1. Or same for those Locust Heavy Destroyers, which get the Enmitic Exterminators, giving you a bit more volume fire against infantry up close. The Doomstalkers do some fairly decent anti-tank, as does the Catan Shard of the Void Dragon, maybe a bit of a meta pick at the moment. A bunch of attacks that are just generally very effective and is hard to bring down in the first place, but with loads of his attacks having the anti-vehicle keyword is a pretty excellent one to be fighting against things like enemy knights, or just vehicles that seem to be quite common right now. Overall, looks like a very scary and well put together list, lots of units that work well in synergy. I do feel like some armies are just pretty much never going to be able to kill the Necron Warriors though, which perhaps does feel just a little bit uninteractive for some of them, unless you do just have absolutely ludicrous crazy amounts of damage output. They're just not going to go down and they're just going to spring back to life. Next up we've got the Tyranids. Looks like the faction's perhaps landing to be mid-tier or lower mid-tier, perhaps the 40k overall. So here's one list that had some fairly decent tournament success, run by a Cameron Gilbert to use it to take 4th at the Element Games Grand Slam with 4 wins and 1 loss. This one looks kind of fun in the way that it looks like it uses a whole bunch of models out of the Leviathan box set. Not everything seems to have made the cut, but we've got a Neurotyrant, some Barb Gaunts, and some Von Ryan's Leapers featured here. The list is with the Tyranid Invasion Swarm, so it can adapt to any particularly skewed list, perhaps lethal hits against full vehicle armies, or chance for a bunch of precision against characters if that makes more sense. The Shadow in the Warp is going to be extra scary for this army as well, as there's a Neurotyrant here, just 105 points for a bug with a fairly decent Flamer type attack, and also makes the Shadow in the Warp -1 leadership, so you get 1 turn of excessive battle shock, which could be quite disruptive, maybe turn 2 or turn 3 or something. On the battle line there's a fair few Gaunts, 4 units of 10 Termagants with Flesh Borers, quite fun to be jumping around with their reactive movement, and could potentially be replenished quite effectively with that Endless Swarm stratagem. There's also a fast moving unit of 10 Hormagaunts as well. They can get a very very long charge off, though maybe don't have crazy amounts of damage output, but throwing a whole bunch of objective control 2 bodies onto points seems nice. There's a unit of 5 Barb Gaunts, which seem to be pretty much auto-include for Tyranids, I'd say. Massive slowing of infantry armies is huge, never mind the fact they are very good damage output against infantry in general. There's a big unit of 10 Genestealers with a new improved 2 wound stat line. They can set up forward, and they've got a Broodlord along with them as well, getting devastating wounds and some big rerolls if they target targets on objectives. Potential for some big Alpha Strike shenanigans there. There's 6 Warriors for some Synapse with ranged bioweapons, Death Spitters and 2 Barb Stranglers. 1 small unit of Von Ryan's Leapers with the fights first. 1 unit of Zone Thropes, which also seem to be pretty optimal for Tyranids at the moment. Massive shooting whichever way they do things, and a 6+ invulnerable save as well. Kind of interesting to see Old One Eye here without any Carnifex guards. Most lists I've seen tend to run him with 2 of them, though I guess he's got a fairly respectable datasheet in his own right with his combat and feel no pain. There's a lone winged Hive Tyrant as well with the Synaptic Linchpin trait. He's got a bone sword for some big melee. And then for a few big bugs, there's the very effective and general purpose shooting Exocrine, a Maleceptor for some closer range psychic shooting and debuffing enemies, and also a sized Hierodule with the acid spray type thing, a big respectable amount of wounds with a 2+ save, and could be a usable one for Overwatch. Looks quite good fun for a strong competitive Tyranid army. I must admit I think I'd be a bit tempted to at least have some Biovores in there for some Spore Mine seeding and slowing down the enemy. Plus their shot out Spore Mines can do certain tactical objective action things. I can't help but think we might see a few more Zone Thropes and a bunch of other lists as well that do seem extraordinarily good for their datasheets. Next up, and certainly one of the other stronger armies in 40k right now, are the Genestealer Cults. They've been consistently placing high at quite a lot of tournaments. This list was run by Justin Janssen, who used it to take third at the Alpine Grand Tournament, with 5 wins to 1 loss, alongside a few other Genestealer Cults who finished around the same sort of placing. The Genestealer Cults have some enormously powerful shenanigans that they can do with their Cult Ambush. When you have units destroyed, they get to recycle them off the board, putting down blip markers automatically for battle line units, and then they just spring back onto the board unless the opponent can reach those blip markers and deal with them and move them away. For the scary battle line units that can be recycled, there's 3 units of 10 Acolyte Hybrids. They all have 4 demo charges. The demo charges are fairly brutal shooting. I guess they could be fairly scary with that drop outside of 3 inches stratagem, so you could throw those demo charges at close range and get the jump on an enemy. There's 3 big blocks of 20 Neophytes which look like prime candidates for recycling. 2 of them have mining lasers and grenade launchers for a bit more anti-tank duty. 1 of them has a seismic cannon loadout with a bunch of Webbers, a bit more anti-infantry focused. Coordinating all these respawns and giving out some free stratagems are a pair of Nexuses, the Genestealer Cult Planetype guys, and they have 2 enormously powerful abilities, targeting 2 units with free stratagems somewhere across the board, very very powerful, and they can also do some very powerful shenanigans with the Cult Ambush tokens, moving a marker 6 inches in both command phases, meaning that your opponent might need to go a little bit further to try and reach them if they want to scrub them off the board. And potentially once they have done their movement and you know that the marker is safe, you could scoot them a bit closer so you actually get the jump on your opponent with your units landing closer to them. Not really too surprised to see 2 of them at 50 points each. There's 2 Primuses that can give some big hit rerolls with their units with their Cult Demagogue rule, plus redeploying some units at the start of the game can be helpful. There's a big scary block of Jackals with the Jackal Alphas, a big scout moving unit there with a whole ton of shots. They can mark a target for some shooting rerolls, and they give the Jackal block a move shoot move type ability, very disruptive when engaging with the enemy. The Outriders also get a rule called Demolition Run, which means that each time you move close to an enemy unit, you get a chance to throw out some demolition charges, and on a 4+ for each biker, you deal a mortal wound. I believe that with the Alphas, you'd actually be able to do that twice, as you're actually making 2 normal moves per turn, so potentially that could be around about 10 or 11 mortal wounds per unit if you roll average. Really quite huge that. Never mind all the actual anti-infantry damage they chip in with their power weapon and small arms. For some big damage dealing, there's a Biophagus leading an enormous unit of 10 Aberrants. They get lethal hits from the Biophagus, a -1 to wounds from the Aberrant's bodyguard rule, and just a whole flurry of damage 3 attacks, which is very nice. And then rounding out the list, there's a Goliath truck which looks like it'd be useful to transport one of the Acolyte squads, and an Achilles Ridge Runner. This one's a handy one to have around just as it gives you an extra AP -1 against 1 unit that it's shot, so it could be a very nice one to mark a target for either demo charges or the Neophytes. Overall, just a very generally scary list there, with a whole ton of bodies that potentially you might slog through the first time and then they might just come straight back at you. Plenty of powerful close range deep strike tricks, and a whole bunch of mortal wound threats from the Jackals as well, which you'd have to take seriously. Seems to be a good time to be a follower of the 4-armed Emperor at the moment. Space Dwarves next, and the Leagues of Votann are unfortunately another faction that really aren't doing quite so well in 10th. Very little play with them in tournaments so far out of the first few weeks. Their index just is a bit lacky in terms of unit options, which maybe isn't ideal in an edition where a whole bunch of different unit abilities is kind of handy to have. And while a few of their units did go down in points, a fair few lost ballistic skill and weapon skill, and the nerf to their judgment tokens was rather massive. That's only so good in terms of damage output now. Having a look over Best Coast pairings, one of the better results for them was this list by Alan Stevely, who used it to win 3 games out of 5 at a tournament called TCM Weekender. Looks like a solid example of what the Votann can bring to the field right now. Perhaps one of the big threats of the list is a unit of 10 Einhir Hearthguard. They've got Concussion Gauntlets for the damage 2, and the Vulcanite Guns for a flurry of mortal wound shots, a Concussion Hammer and Weaver Field, and I guess they're going to be joined by that Einhir champion. He takes the Mass Hammer for some serious anti-tank, plus Grim Demeanor as the Warlord trait, a bit more reliability with rerolling Battle Shock and ignoring modifiers. There's 2 units of Hearthkin Warriors, one of which looks like they'll be joined by the Carl potentially. He's got a Plasma Axe, Rampart Crest, Vulcanite Disintegrator, and the Appraising Glare trait. That one's a bit of a weird one in the Votann index in that it's probably the best of the enhancements, means that you get more judgment tokens against units on one certain objective each turn. But it is also waiting for Games Workshop for an FAQ as well, as there's a typo in it that says that it only applies till the end of the command phase, and they probably mean the end of the turn. Kind of annoying as that's the one that I rate as by far the best. The Hearthkin take the L7 missile launcher, which looks like one of the better ones as you get to move and fire it up to 24 inches with some general purpose shots. They also pick up the Magna Rail Rifle despite the closer range and the heavy keyword, plus they get the standard squad upgrades including the Medic. There's 2 units of 5 Chthonian Berserks, which I guess might be riding in the Land Fortress for a battlefield bunker to charge out of. They're using Plasma Axes, and one picks up the Concussion Gauntlets, which seem to be fairly auto-include for a nice generalist profile that can punch up a bit. There's 2 units of the Brockir Thunderkin. These ones are all taking the Graviton Blast Cannons, which are short range at just 18 inches, but they seem by far the best damage profile. Anti-Vehicle 2+ with damage 3 weapons is great for fighting quite a lot of the armies that are out there in 10th at the moment, plus just a whole bunch of shots with blast means they're effective against hordes as well. One of them has the Brockir Ironmaster and his retinue in the squad, a bunch of small models to tank some high strength damage, a +1 to hit, and he can also chip in with some extra grav shooting as well. I guess in theory you could put the small squad in the Land Fortress for some rerolls, or if they're not foot slogging I suppose they could come in strategic reserve and have a threat emerging from the edge of the board. The Land Fortress itself takes the Rail Cannon, a very big and swingy threat, particularly if it's hitting on a 4+ if you need to move it and you don't have a Judgment token, but if you do hit then it's going to be felt quite a lot with a massive d6+6 damage if it gets through. It's backed up by the auto cannons and some bolt cannons, and it ignores cover with the Panspectral Scanner. Could also be a fairly terrifying one to have that counter-shooting stratagem go off on. Might make vehicles just a little bit scared against taking pot shots at it, unless it just turns around and gets lucky and just vaporizes them with the Rail Cannon. Finally, for some scouting midfield and anti-infantry things, there's 3 units of 3 Hernkin Pioneers. All of these take the Highlight Rotary Cannons, plus the Scanner for ignoring cover and the Searchlight to ignore stealth. Maybe a little bit more skewed to do anti-infantry duty now, as opposed to being fairly general purpose with the auto-wound judgment tokens last edition, but still pretty good skirmishers to hold down things in the midfield and get to objectives and things. They are definitely a hard faction to play with though. A lot of their units are just really quite overcosted for what they do, and they're still kind of slow and purposeful, without quite as much crazy damage or void armor to protect them. Will be interesting to see if anyone can manage some top tournament placements with them until Games Workshop makes some balance changes. Next up we've got the Tau Empire. This was listed by Hunter CMs who used it to take 4th at the Boise Cup, winning 4 games out of 5 on a biggish tournament of 50 players. The only flavour of Tau at the moment is Cao Yun, no option for a Mont card attachment yet, but it does mean that they get some serious damage output boosts from turn 3 onwards, and one of the units can get that on turn 2 as well, with the Cold Star Commander getting Exemplar of Cao Yun. It means that his Crisis Battlesuit squad will be hitting with the double exploding 6s, all the way from turn 2, provided they've got a unit to spot for them. The main heavy lifters of the list seem to be a Cold Star Commander and a Crisis Commander, both joining a whole bunch of Crisis suits and everyone with absolutely maximal Cyclic Ion Blasters, and a bunch of shield drones included for some extra wounds now. The Cyclic Ion Blasters can spit out really quite a massive amount of Strength 8, AP2 and Damage 2 fire, so will whittle down just about anything that they're pointed at, but if you are overcharging them all the time, you do risk some hazardous rolls, and that could actually be kind of nasty for these. The Cold Star Commander makes his unit a bit faster, the Crisis Commander gets you to reroll 1s for the unit. They could be potentially interesting targets for Move Shoot Move as well, which the Tau can do for 2 CP. Otherwise we've got Commander Shadowsun, who's really quite a good include for the Tau at the moment I think. Fairly general purpose fusion blasters and a reroll 1's aura of her own, plus Lone Operative. A small potential to farm some stratagems used for nearby units definitely doesn't hurt as well. Taking the fight to the midfield objective, there's 2 units of 10 breachers with devilfish. They can zip up quite fast, get a bunch of objective control points there, and then really hammer out a lot of damage output as they get to reroll wound rolls against things that are on objectives. Really quite nice with mid-strength and decent AP shots. There's some Vespid Stingwings which can jump on and off the board and look quite nice for objective type things. Some stealth suits which can be deployed in the midfield and are kind of annoying to deal with. A big unit of broadsides for some dedicated anti-tank with their heavy rail rifles and seeker missile launchers, plus a bunch of extra wounds from their shield drones added onto their wound profile. And finally there's a ghost kill in play as well. These guys get lone operatives, so can be actually some fairly scary firepower that your opponent can't catch up with as easily as some things. This one's got a cyclic ion raker and some fusion blasters, so it can chip in with some longer range damage output while staying at least fairly safe from the main enemy gun line. Finally there's another lone operative in the Firesight team. They can be quite a good one for spotting targets and could chip in with a tiny bit of sniper damage as well if it matters. Overall feels like it's a list that definitely plays into the Tau strength at the moment. Even with all the shield drones and things though, it's going to be a lot easier to kill the units here than it might have been in days past for the Tau. Just having extra wounds on your profile isn't anywhere near as big as having extra individual models with invulnerable saves. They were really quite nice for soaking up really big enemy hits on crisis suit blocks before. Finally, we've got the forces of the greenskins, at least early on in 10th edition with all the faction rules it seems like they're going to be very melee focused. A big war for 1 turn giving you a 5+ invulnerable save, advance and charge in combat buffs, then doubling down on more combat boosts with their war tribe for exploding 6s. This list was by Chance Hallinan, who used it to place 7th at the Boise Cup GT, winning 4 games out of 5. Has quite a lot of different flavours of greenskin violence on offer here. Leading the list we've got Ghazghkull Thraka. He's leading up a big unit of 6 Meganobs with Makari in tow as well, giving them all +1 to hit and wound, and he also gives everyone an aura of lethal hits in combat within 12 inches when you call the war as well. Kind of nice with the Ork profiles that might struggle to punch up against vehicles a bit. There's 2 big kill rigs venturing forward. They each have a squad of 10 Beast Snagger boys inside, who are quite solid generalists, being pretty good at anti-infantry normally, and at least having a decent boost against vehicles and monsters to get some more hits on them, even if their strength profile still will struggle a bit. One of them's led up by a beast boss as well, with the cunning but brutal trait. His unit can shoot and charge in a turn in which it fell back. We've also got Boss Snickrot being quite a big melee threat in the midfield, leading up a squad of 10 commandos. They could certainly threaten a pretty massive charge turn 1 if they wanted to. In the unit there's a bomb twig for some mortal wounds, a big chopper and a breacher ram, plus Boss Snickrot chips in himself with a whole bunch of strength 6 and damage 2 attacks with twin linked and precision. There's a unit of 10 Gretchen which can farm up some command points on home objectives, a unit of 6 Squighog boys who are led up by a Nob on a Smasher Squig. He just adds a bit more overall might to the unit and gives them +1 to the hit roll as well, so quite a powerful combat threat there. A big unit of 10 Storm Boys, which seem really quite nice for jump infantry, really big movement, and also the ability to advance and charge as well. Very easy to get stuck into the enemy at either turn 1 or turn 2, depending on where they're positioned. And for a tiny bit of efficient firepower, there's 2 individual mech guns with custom mega cannons. There still seem to be some of the more efficient firepower in the greenskin list. Overall looks like a scary list with a lot of pressure, lots of threats that you just can't really ignore too much, and the potential to hit the enemy pretty hard quite early in the game, with early game charges from things like Commandos and Storm Boys in the mix, plus just advancing and charging with the kill rigs could be big in itself. So anyway, there we have it, 1 strong list for each 40k index army. Let me know what you make of them or any other insights as to how they were played down in the comments, or what other things you think might be helpful for each faction that might or might not have been represented here. Look forward to hearing all your thoughts as always. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos in the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.